Hello and welcome. After a summer break, we are back to our series related to human rights and psychology. Today, the title of the webinar is Torture and the Role of the Psychology Profession. And we normally try to connect our topics with some important days that we can find on the UN list. So we connected this topic with the International Day of the Victims of Enforced Disappearances, which was on August the 30th. Today's speakers are Nora Sveaass from Norway and Perez-Sales from Spain. Our, let's call her resident moderator, is Aimee Karam from Lebanon. And your hosts for today are Mary Bullock, who resides in the United States and Estonia, and I'm Marlena Plavšić. There are some basic information that I would like to share with you so that you can easily follow the webinar. And I would like to introduce the two organizations that are hosting the webinar series, which we started with last year. So we are approaching the end of our second year of this series. One of the organizations is the Global Network of Psychologists for Human Rights, which tries to provide information and educational materials for human rights, about human rights for psychologists. And you can find the information, the bulletin, and the announcements on our website. Please have a look and subscribe. It's for free. The other organization that is the host is the International Council of Psychologists, which is committed to promoting human rights, dignity, and justice. And I'm very happy to announce the annual meeting this year that will happen on December the 2nd with the topic Human Rights, Dignity and Justice, Empowerment for All. So please go to this website and find more information about the event. The basic technical information for easier following of the webinar are the following. You have the chance to ask questions in two ways. You can put them either in the chat box or in the Q&A box. And in the discussion part of the webinar, which comes later, we will address the questions according to the speakers and their preferences and their field of expertise. Then most of you ask us about the certificate of attendance. We provide them automatically to the addresses, email addresses which you registered from if you attended at least 40 minutes of the webinar. If you are looking at us, watching the webinar from a different address than the one that you registered from, please let us know by sending us an email on the address that you can see here on the screen. Also, you can find because we turned on the closed caption function, you can find it on your screen and you can turn it on and use it in case that you need it. And now I will give floor to Aimee, our moderator, to introduce our today's speakers. Aimee, the floor is yours.
I am delighted to introduce our very distinguished speakers, Dr. Nora Sveaass and Dr. Perez-Sales. Dr. Nora Sveaass is a professor emerita at the University of Oslo in Norway. For many years, she has been engaged in clinical work with refugees as senior psychologist at the Psychosocial Center for Refugees at the University of Oslo. She leads research projects linked to family therapy with traumatized refugee families, on rehabilitation of victims of torture, and on transitional justice mechanism. Dr. Sveaass has written numerous books and journal articles on psychology, forced migration, and human rights, in particular in relation to the right to redress and rehabilitation. She has worked clinically and in context of research and training on issues related to gender-based violence in conflict, and she is the initiator and head of board of the Health and Human Rights Info in an NGO providing information on health and human rights for professionals working in conflict areas. She served as chair of the Human Rights Committee for the Norwegian Association for Human Rights from 1998 until 2019, and she was a member of the UN Committee Against Torture from 2005 to 2013, and was a member and vice chair of the UN Subcommittee for the Prevention of Torture. In 2009, she was awarded Amnesty International Award in Norway for her work on human rights, and in 2019, she received the University of Oslo's Human Rights Prize. Dr. Pau Perez-Sales is a senior consultant in psychiatry at the Hospital La Paz in Madrid in Spain since 1996. He obtained his PhD in psychiatry at the Universitas Autónoma in Madrid in 1994. He has contributed to different popular organizations in Latin America since 1988. He was a founder and coordinator of the Community Action Group Mental Health and Human Rights Resource Center from 1997 until 2012. He is the clinical director at the Center for Forensic Assessment and Rehabilitation of Victims of Political Violence. He has been forensic expert in national and international courts for victims of mistreatment and violence since 1996. His experience includes, among others, litigation in European Court of Human Rights and Inter-American Court of Human Rights. He was the chair of the section of psychological consequences of persecution and torture in the World Psychiatric Association from 2015 until 2019. And he is editor-in-chief of the Torture Journal. He has authored more than 80 papers and books relevant to mental health and psychosocial work in political violence. And the most recent one is Psychological Torture, Definition, Evaluation, and Measurement. Dr. Sveaass, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. In a moment, we will be together. Thank you very much for your fine words of introduction. And as you probably all understand, working against torture or against all forms of human rights violations have been in my heart for many, many years. And today it's a big challenge to be able to communicate with you psychologists all over the world, because I'm sure that we as psychologists have a very important role both in preventing and prohibiting torture and in rehabilitation, which is also the right given the international conventions. So again, thank you for the introduction and thank you for inviting us to this. We are going to speak, Pau and I, today about torture, which no doubt is the most hideous human rights violation that we know about. It does destroy not only mind and body of the one who is subjected, but their family, their close ones, the society and values as well. Torture is universally prohibited. There is absolutely no justification for torture, and torture is also, or freedom from torture is also, a non-derogable right. This means, as we know, for instance, from the COVID time, that there were some rights that could be put aside for a period of time. Assembly, traveling, all of those rights were suspended some months or even a couple of years during the pandemic, whereas freedom from torture can never be put aside. It is always a right we have, so the prohibition against torture is total in war, in conflict, under threat, in situations of emergency. This is important for us to be very aware about. The prohibition against torture is defined in many of our mostly known declarations. First of all, the Universal Declarations of Human Rights, Article 5. We have the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, often called the Human Rights Convention, in Article 7. We have the European Human Rights Convention, Article 3. We have, of course, the UN Convention Against Torture, which I will speak a little bit more about. And we have the Geneva Conventions, the one that we often call humanitarian laws, that is the human rights in war. Because even in war, people shall not be tortured or exposed to other forms of violations such as rape, etc. This is important for us to remember these days, because we know that also sexual violence is going on at a very gross level in war and conflict. And today the prohibition is accepted as customary international law. This means that the prohibition counts, and the prohibition is an obligation also by states who have not necessarily signed the conventions I have listed above. So again, the formulation is: no one shall be subjected to torture or to cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment and punishment. Today we will speak about torture and inhuman punishment, cruel and inhuman punishment, and we will look at also the psychological aspects. We will challenge the distinction between psychological and physical torture. We think that it does not exist, but it can be defined or spoken more clearly about, as Pau will do in a couple of minutes. But I'll come back to the UN Convention Against Torture, which is perhaps the world's most important instrument in fighting torture. It came into force in 1987, which makes it quite a number of years. 173 states have ratified, and there is an ongoing campaign to have this convention universally ratified. We're not there still, but a lot of people, including states, are actively working to have the Torture Convention universally ratified. What does the convention say? What are the obligations? And remember, when we speak about the human rights conventions, we define the obligations that the states have. Each and one of the states that have ratified the conventions have these obligations in a legally binding way. This is very important for us as psychologists to know, because we work often in public systems and we deal with governments, we deal with authorities, and we need to know what their absolutely clear obligations under these conventions are. I've mentioned already, which is important, the total prohibition against torture. Also, I mentioned the non-justification for torture. But there's also the obligation to prevent torture. It's not only stopping it if it's there, it's in order to take all possible measures to avoid and to prevent torture from happening. And I will say some words about that in a moment. Also, there is the obligation never to return persons to the risk of torture. This is what is called the principle of non-refoulement, and is extremely important in asylum context, because people are not supposed to be returned to situations where they can risk torture. This is why they're asking for protection, and this is why they are entitled to protection. This is Article 3 of the Convention. There is also the obligation to provide redress, rehabilitation, and reparation. Article 14 in the Convention Against Torture is very clear on the obligation of the state to provide redress to all persons exposed to torture and cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment and punishment. And this redress can be legal justice, and it can also be rehabilitation as much as possible. And finally, there's also the obligation to train medical and other relevant professionals. Article 10 of the Convention Against Torture is again crystal clear on the obligation of state to train people such as us, medical or health professionals, all persons in uniform, and all people that are relevant as people coming into contact with the problem of torture or with victims or survivors of torture. So again, this is an obligation which is often very much not respected. So what is torture? We must remember that torture, as the definition says, it is intentionally inflicted pain or suffering, mental as well as physical, or both. So it is intended it is intended with a purpose. And these purposes can be providing information. It can also be punishing, threatening. There's a whole range of purposes that may be used, just put it that way, to argue, or that states will argue the use of torture. Or to put it that way, when we see that this physical intentional pain is being done, we're speaking about torture. But also it's about intimidating or coercing, and reasons based on discrimination. And this is very important, that we can call something torture if we see that the pain that has been suffered has been intended or inflicted for reasons of discrimination. This is important in discussions on racism, on gender, etc. So we must remember discrimination is one of these reasons. And the fourth point is when it is inflicted or at the instigation of or with consent or acquiescence of people that are public officials or persons acting in an official capacity. And when we as health workers work in the public system or work with a permission to work, we are in this box. So we must be very aware of that acts that we can do, acts that some colleagues can do, actually can be understood in the worst case as torture or ill treatment. And remember also that each state shall take effective legislative, administrative, judicial, or other measures to prevent acts of torture. And this actually includes prevent actions of torture or ill treatment also by private actors, which means that the state, if the state should have known that private violence is going on or violence by private actors, they also have the obligation to stop, to hinder, to prevent, and protect. So it's important that this term, also private actors, are being included in the definition. And the failure to protect and prevent, the lack of due diligence in situations where the state should have known that harm is being done, may be considered a violation under the convention, according to the general comment number 2 of the Convention Against Torture. So the obligation to prevent torture is far-ranging. And now we will go over to psychological torture, and I will give the floor to Pau, and I will come back and we will have a discussion towards the end. Thank you. Pau, the floor is yours.
Sorry, I was mute. Thank you very much, Nora. It's really an honor for me to share this talk with you, who was probably the first one to talk about psychological torture when nobody was still thinking or writing about it. And we wanted to put the focus on psychological torture because probably there is some kind of misunderstanding when we think that torture is about physical pain, torture is about broken bones, and torture is about medical profession. Probably nowadays, the psychologist has a more important role than even doctors in the prevention, in the documentation of torture. Why? Because psychological torture is the torture of future, because the society doesn't accept torture as we understand it now. And this is why we wanted to stress this role in this talk today. We want to share with you a short video, a very short presentation. And I think that the video probably explains better than we can do on what is psychological torture. I will ask you to try to think which are the elements in this very short presentation that produce the breaking of the person that appears in the video, the essential elements that break the person.
You're putting it on, Pau?
Yeah, no,
Good.
You're right. I'm not sharing. Sorry for that. I was still seeing your presentation.
doing? Yeah? All right. How was school? Good girl. I'll be back soon. Sure, just a couple of days. Listen, sweetheart, can you do me a favor, huh? Can you go to the window and blow Daddy a kiss? Can you do that? I love you too.
Okay. What you see, well, this is a video from Amnesty International. What breaks the person, it's an enormous amount of things, but the most important thing is not pain itself. It's fear leading to panic and terror. It's humiliation. It's being blindfolded, so impossible to orient, impossible to have control, being helpless and in the hands of other, is what we call the fight against yourself, having to fight against the pain you feel in your legs, in your back, and of course, the expectancy of more suffering and not knowing what will happen after that. No? So there is just one situation in which the interrogator hits the person just to remind that pain is a possibility, but all the other is a psychological process of breaking the person. So physical and psychological torture are mixed, of course, but basically here what we see is the psychological elements that make a person helpless, and finally that destroy the personality, which is one of the elements in the definition of torture. So,
excuse me. Do you want us to see? Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, I was just introducing. So that's the idea. As Nora said before, there is one torture. There is no psychological and physical torture. Both are related and one leads to the other. But we want to put the emphasis in those situations in which the psychological side is essential and is probably the most important element in this process of breaking the victim. Those are testimonies of survivors. I will not read them at long. They are from different countries, but they talk about the same things. The waiting time, a waiting breaks a person. Not knowing is terrible when you are not informed why you are detained, why you are in a place, etc. Fear will accompany you forever. The fear is embodied. My body keeps a permanent memory of it, and it comes in strange pains, unrepentant, insomnia. The terror, the unpredictable, the illogical, the uncertain. So these elements which are linked to dignity, which are linked to what we call secondary emotions, shame, guilt, and fear, your own expectations, are a psychological process that help us to understand the impacts of torture. So we want to challenge that idea. The idea that torture is not necessarily equivalent to pain. Torture is about manipulating expectation. Torture is about terror. And I think that this means a change of outlook, and this is what Nora and me wanted to introduce. We talk about psychological torture when we refer to the use of techniques of physical, cognitive, emotional, or sensory attacks. You saw all them in the video that target the conscious mind, aiming to coerce, to break the will, and ultimately to produce an identity breakdown of the person. You saw before the legal definition of torture. Nora exposed the 5 elements of the legal definition of torture. This is a medical and psychological definition of torture. And of course, all these attacks, physical, cognitive, emotional, and sensory attacks, produce a suffering and produce a damage in most of the persons exposed to them. This is a classification of psychological torture methods. As you can see, it considers 3 types of psychological torture methods. One, which is those in which it's a pure cognitive and emotional suffering produced, for instance, by threats, which is the most frequent and universal method of torture worldwide, or through the manipulation of emotions, producing shame, guilt, or humiliation. Type 2 is when you don't touch the body, but you make a manipulation of it. For instance, solitary confinement. For instance, all the elements of manipulation of the environment, heat, humidity, or the space here. It's sleep deprivation, or it's hunger and thirst. And finally, there are those physical attacks that in fact target the mind. For instance, as you saw in the video, stress positions, when the person is forced to be in a position that is very painful, but nobody is in fact acting on him, or drying with asphyxia, when the plastic bag, or the waterboarding techniques, or sexual harassment or rape. Those are things in which, of course, there is a physical attack, but the impact on the mind is much more disproportionate than the physical danger would in fact mean. So there are many techniques that target the mind, that can break the person, and this is just a very brief outline of them. We wanted also to stress another concept. The idea of torture is expanding during the last 10, 20 years, and that idea that torture means international torture, means police, means interrogation, well, this is challenged every time more, and torture, we see it's linked to gender violence and not having access to gender rights, or for instance to torture in demonstrations or in non-custodial settings, or torture linked to internet or to social networks. There are many, many new fields in which the definition of torture can be applied, and this is one of them. This is a refugee camp. This is the Moria camp in Greece, in Europe, and it shows a place where, if you take one by one the different elements that produce suffering in the persons, probably you would not say that this is torture. But if you take the combined, the prolonged effect of all the single elements that interact here, then you have to talk about a torturing environment. And this is a new concept that we are introducing. For instance, as you see in this paper, refugee camps as torturing environments. So that's also a new idea, a new theoretical idea we wanted to introduce you to show the importance of the psychological profession. We talk about the torturing environment when we have a set of conditions or practices that obliterate the control and will of a detainee and that compromise the self. And there are many torturing environments. This refugee camp, it's an example, or a migration detention center is an example. But for instance, this is also an example. This is a cell for solitary confinement. You can be here for 22, 23 hours. You don't have any access to meaningful contact with other human beings. And as you see, no access to any kind of TV or books or whatever. This is a torturing environment. So there are many new fields that expand the definition, the legal definition of torture that Nora shared, and the psychologists can have a very important, essential role in the forensic, in the documentation, the forensic work in this situation. The expert can help to delimit all the areas of subjectivity of the definition we shared before. The severity of suffering, how do we measure the suffering and the subjective impact? Not always suffering is equivalent to pathological consequence or to clinical symptoms. Sometimes there is severe suffering, but there are no sequels. So how do we manage to show the suffering? the credibility of the description of events of delegate victim in context where torture doesn't have witnesses, where it's the word of the perpetrator against the word of the victims, or the elements of the definition of intentionality and purpose of the alleged perpetrator. So there are many elements in which the role of the psychologist is essential to document. Nora, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you again, Pau, and thanks for all of you following us. As you understand, we are really embarking on something both terrible, tragic, and very complex and difficult. What Pau has mentioned now is so important to look at the environment, or all the different elements coming up together. If we look just at the camp, the refugee camp, people may say, but this is not intentional. It's not intended to cause pain and suffering, which is the definition of torture. But putting everything together and seeing the lack of due diligence, seeing the lack of willingness to prevent, to stop, to protect, I think we are in our full right, and the term torture has been used to describe such situations as well. Often it is said conditions amounting to torture, or conditions that may even range to the level of torture. Often in prison situations where people are living under very dire situations, these descriptions have been used to underline that we're speaking about a situation that amounts to torture, because altogether the lack of due diligence, the lack of willingness to change may be understood also as an intention to harm. So this is a long discussion, and probably there will be questions related to this, and we will try to reply as much as we can. But I want to try to focus and follow up what Pau said about the role of psychologists, because I do strongly believe in the many different ways in which we can contribute to the prevention and to the support of people who are in danger of torture or of treatment. So if we look at prevention, just to look at this, take that first. We are all, as psychologists, working in different contexts. Many of us, we are in hospitals, we may be in prisons, even in the police station, in childcare, working with people with disability, in psychiatric institutions. If we look into where often violations are found, these are places where these are found. Not only prisons and police stations, but hospitals, places for children, for people with disabilities as well. So our presence in these places must really strengthen our work to prevent, to report, to also inform people about where are people's rights, in order for the state also to live up to their obligations, and because again, reporting is so important, so that the states or those responsible are aware of what is happening on the ground. It is quite obvious that we have treatment and rehabilitation on our list of main actions that we are doing, and we will receive in countries where torture is practiced in prisons, etc. Many of you will meet people who come out of prisons and they have histories of torture. Some of us will perhaps mostly deal with torture victims when they come as asylum seekers and refugees, but nevertheless, treatment and rehabilitation is a right and it's an obligation, including on us. We can work on advocacy. We have a big job to do on education. We can also develop on policy and awareness raising. We can talk about, report, and provide information. For instance, we have people here, I know from the Philippines. When Philippines is being heard by the UN bodies, psychologists and others in the Philippines may very well provide reports, alternative reports, to those who are questioning the country, in this case the Philippines, to provide them with information so that they can go a bit deeper. We have an important role here. And finally, documentation and investigation of torture. And I will spend a couple of minutes on this in particular. We have been speaking about documentation of torture for many years. And in 1998, there was a manual that was developed called the Istanbul Protocol. It became a UN document in 2004, and it is the manual or handbook on effective investigation and documentation of torture and other cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment and punishment. This is not a convention or a protocol in that legal sense. It is defined as a golden standard, and it's definitely a gray among those legal gray documents that is called. It's referred to by a number of treaty bodies and UN activists and members and workers, and we as, of all people should really be aware of it. This Istanbul Protocol has been updated and was launched in June 22 in Geneva, and it has new chapters. One is very important, which has been looked upon for a long time, namely guidelines on documenting torture and ill treatment of children. But there's also a big new chapter on the role of health professionals in documenting torture and ill treatment, and on the Istanbul Protocol implementation. And one of the chapters that has been expanded quite a lot is the one on documenting torture, which is not so easily seen or documented through scars and other physical evidence. So here again, as Paul referred to, we have a big challenge in front of us to be able to try to describe both the context and the reactions of people in order to document this as torture and ill treatment. So why do we document torture? First of all, it's about clarification of facts and establishment of acknowledgements. Very important in situations of asylum seekers. Have they been tortured? Is this something that should be considered in their protection application? So it's about considering and clarification what has been done. Also, measures needed to prevent recurrence. People often ask, why is documentation important in prevention? And I can assure you it's extremely important, because it's through documentation of cases we can work on preventing more of these from coming and from happening. Documentation is also important in treatment and rehabilitation, and people may go for years and months without having their needs and their problems and their injuries looked at or looked into, and the Istanbul Protocol can provide us with this standard and handbook also to describe injuries for the preparation of treatment as well. Also, in any court case, think of all those who are now seeking compensation and seeking redress and justice after having been exposed to wars and to trauma and to torture in different contexts. Having documentation from an Istanbul Protocol documentation is extremely important. So compensation and redress is highly needed here. So the new version of the Istanbul Protocol says very clearly that all clinicians who conduct clinical evaluations of alleged or suspected cases of torture or ill treatment should do this in accordance with the Istanbul Protocol and its principles. And of course, the conducting these evaluations should be done in line with the principles, but a forensic certificate is not necessarily required, although many countries will say that we will not accept anything which is, if it's not from a public forensic expert. This may be a dilemma, especially in non-democratic society. Therefore, we strongly recommend that many of you, as many as possible, really get to learn about this and do the practice. And there's a long list and there's many pages devoted in the Istanbul Protocol on the interpretation of results. So I highly recommend, and this has to be just very brief. So to conclude, psychologists may have many important roles to play in order to strengthen the protection against torture and CIDT, cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment and punishment, and ensure justice and redress for those subjected to this violence, including ensuring the right to rehabilitation. Thank you very much, and we look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much for this excellent presentation. It was really, and all the efforts that you have put to explain to us this very important concept, and to shed the light on the role of psychologists in how to address or how to deal with torture. I will go to the questions that are being asked. One of the questions that also summarize other questions is, does torture always need to involve state actors, like someone in an official role? And how can we distinguish interpersonal violence that can occur between two people in a family or in a couple or among parents toward their children, and torture as such.
How shall I start by trying to answer? This is an extremely important question, and I will start first of all to say that according to the definition, torture is inflicted pain or suffering by persons who are close to or in any way linked to state or to state officials. One has to find a way or a connection for it to be torture. That said, it's also important that the state obligation has the absolute obligation to prevent torture and know that things are happening. That means that if they allow or if they see or do not react towards private actors acting, for instance, you have a private place for children with disabilities, and then it comes out that it may be church, it may be a club, it may be any place, and it comes out that here there is a lot of pain and suffering going on, sometimes as punishment, as intended, and sometimes as lack of care. Then the state can very well be held accountable for torture because they have not stopped private actors from torturing others. They have allowed it to happen, so to speak. So this is a long and complex discussion, but this is one of the ways that the Torture Committee now for years has practiced these rules. It will not necessarily say that the state is or the church is doing torture, but the state has violated the Torture Convention by not stopping private actors being violent to others. Then you ask about the interpersonal violence and torture, the distinction. Of course, if I hit or if I'm violent towards someone else will report me, and the police will take me, arrest me, investigate me, and hopefully put me to prison. So then we're speaking about regular crime committed by one civilian to another, and the authorities react with due diligence, investigate, punish, and redress the person who has suffered. But if the state or public officials neglect or do not react in terms of violations that are taking place, do not react when there is serious family problems going on for a long time and they should have known, then we can even speak about torture, cruel, inhuman, degrading treatment, or torture. Or they can even say that we don't mind that this kind of violence is taking place. We think it's a part of a good disciplinary measure, so we don't mind. We don't even have a law against this. We had that, for instance, in domestic violence, lack of laws hindering domestic violence. And then, of course, this is a state responsibility. If the court cannot judge anyone because of lacks of limitations in the law, well, that is a break against the Torture Convention.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
There is a question that came to my mind about when state officials take this initiative or allow themselves to practice torture, and when it is within the policy of a system, or within the policy of a prison, for example, or the policy of a refugee camp, something. What to do, like how to denounce torture when it is practiced, like between brackets, officially.
Pau, you let me know if you want to reply.
Yes, please. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, if I understand well the question, you ask how to document torture when it's the state who is practicing it. And well, in fact, it's the state who practices torture in most times. And of course, the Istanbul Protocol states which are the conditions for a proper investigation when there are torture allegations. There are 7 conditions that the state must comply for do a proper investigation. It must be independent, it must be prompt, it must be, and so on. So there are certain conditions to be accomplished, and in fact, there are more countries who are condemned for not doing a proper research of allegations of torture than for doing torture. The problem is that in many times, if the state is involved, the state will look to the another side and will not want to acknowledge that is practicing torture. So there is a denial as a state policy, and then it's independent organizations, human rights groups, and international missions who must document it. But of course, the state, as signatory of the convention, is the first responsible to investigate any allegation of people linked to the state as perpetrator.
And I could just add also that it's very clear in the Convention Against Torture that if the state receives information, for instance, that personnel in police or in the police or in prison officers are beating or violate in any way the prisoners, when these kind of reports reach the authorities, they must take action. And even in Article 4 of the Torture Convention, there is that they must be punished accordingly. So there is a very clear obligation of the state to investigate and to punish those who have been responsible to different forms of violations of this kind in state settings or in public settings. So this is absolutely very clear. There's no excuse. But as you say, Pau, there's also a tendency to try to hide, not to look at it. And when we ask states, and here we is the Committee Against Torture, when we ask states, how many cases have you investigated, for instance, of violent police or nurses or doctors or whoever who have been accused of violations? And they say, oh, we've had 170 cases. And we say, okay, how many have been judged? How many have received punishment? Oh, 1 and 2. So sometimes it's not as clear cut as it should be according to the convention.
Yeah, and I would add, Nora has explained the basic elements in the convention, but there is also the optional protocol to the convention that establishes in those countries that are signatories of it what we call the National Prevention Mechanism of Torture. And this is it should be an independent body that makes unexpected visits to places of detention and try to document allegations of torture. Today, probably 50% of all cases of torture happen in closed spaces, in prisons, in psychiatric hospitals, in centers for minors, and so on. So the role of the National Prevention Mechanism is essential. Probably what has changed more the landscape of the anti-torture fight in the last 20 years has been the appearance of the NPMs, and I think that it's a mechanism that should be strengthened and empowered as much as possible.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. There are 2 or 3 other questions. I will just ask them, and you choose what to do about it and who's gonna develop the answers. There is a question about the vicarious trauma, like for people who are dealing with extreme situations where emotions are really very painful to tolerate and to go through. How do you do as people who are working with this situation to protect yourself? And this is what we call, I think, the vicarious trauma. This is one question. The second question is about the Hoffman report. Someone would like to have your opinion about it. And the third question is about possible training that people, psychologists, people who are working in mental health, if there is a possibility to get more educated in this field and to have the proper way to work with people who are who have been exposed to torture.
Well, I will begin by the end, by training. I think that there is a wide network of centers around the world that work in the rehabilitation of torture survivors. There are 2 very big networks: the OMCT, who has more than 300 centers all around the world, and the IRCT, which is a network of 184 centers around the world. So probably close to you, there is one center where you can have training and where you can have the possibility of being volunteer or having some direct experience. Nora has also said that there are different training models in the internet. You can find training models by Physicians for Human Rights USA, for instance, or there is also a European program by the Council of Europe where you can be trained on documentation of torture. So there are different possibilities for having trained. But I would dare to say that the best way to receive training is trying to be involved and trying to be volunteer and work with survivors, the best way to learn. Regarding vicarious trauma, how to protect yourself? Well, there are enormous things on that, so it's not a question you can answer in 2 minutes. Of course, everyone knows her or his limits and whether you can cope or not with horror. And obviously, working with survivors is working with the dark side of the human being, and this needs being able to hear to the horror and to accepting the horror, because the difficult to put words to horror is and the wall that the survivor feels between him or her and the one who wants to provide care is part of the problem in working. So you must know your own limits, and then of course you have to be sensible to your own reactions to the victim and seeing whether you feel too much moved and you are too empathic, and then you're making the problems of others your own problems, and then this means that you don't have the psychological conditions for doing that. Or the opposite, when you feel too distant and when you can hear the most horrible things and you don't move, and this probably means that you are applying technical criteria, but you need a basic element of approaching the victim and listening to the victim also with part of you that is necessary to connect, to make this emotional connection that allows working. So it's a process of knowing yourself, it's a process of reflection, it's a process of trying to have a supervision and trying to understand what is moving inside you when you attend this kind of victims.
Yeah.
Please, Nora.
It's just very tempting to follow up on what you said, Pao, because I think also that I think that education and training for ourselves also as persons on human rights and human rights violations and the consequences of human rights abuses also is of importance. And for instance, to practice and to work and try to do something, because I think the worst thing to be vicariously traumatized is by being completely passive and only receiving. If you participate, try to do something, can also help you psychologically. And I would say, and I'm very happy that Pao mentioned the NPMs, because the National Preventive Mechanisms should always be psychologists in this mechanism, because they are doing a lot of interviews in closed settings, only those that are deprived of liberty, and the need for being psychologically well skilled is extremely important. So, and I want, of course, also to discuss or to say something about the Hoffman report, but I would like to add just one thing to the training issue. I think that we as psychologists and other health workers who may be listening to us now should do it as a big thing to require from their own states that teaching in psychology, teaching in human rights should be a required part of the curriculum. And that is why Marlena and myself and others edited the book on human rights education for psychologists some years ago, from which our chapter is one of the chapters, so the thing we're presenting today. So and tomorrow I will be in Norway spending 2 days with all Norwegian universities to teach them or to find people who can teach human rights in the different psychology departments. So it's really worth working on to see this happen in all faculties of psychology all over the world. So keep up that good work. As for the Hoffman report, it was, of course, a shock when it came in, goodness, many years ago now. 15 was it? Yeah. Anyway, it was an eye-opener to all of us, and many of you may be aware that was where the APA it was described and how they in some way had participated and not reacted in any good way to the violations that had been done in the prisons or in the detention centers where people accused of terrorism were held legally and illegally. So that, of course, opened a big discussion and changed some things within the APA system. I do hear that there's some changes that may be going also backwards a bit again, but I think that every psychological association in the whole world should be so clear about keeping up with the conventions, not allowing any derogation from any of these basic rights, and should also ensure that all members of the profession are aware of what they're doing, and also that there is accountability for those who are not aware. So Hoffman opened big, shocking doors. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. There is one more question about the confidentiality, because you have insisted on the importance of documenting the torture and what has been done. So how do you deal with confidentiality in this kind of situation?
Problematic. Pau, do you want to start on that one? Because it's extremely relevant question.
Yeah. The Istanbul Protocol is very, very clear on that, that any documentation of torture must be done in private. Nobody that could have a coercive role should be present. And there is the right of being in on the one side in privacy, and on the other side that the information you provide the person is kept in a sure place and just transmitted to the judge, to the court, or to the lawyer, to the persons who are involved in the legal process. So that's a basic right. In fact, if this is not respected, the assessment is considered non-valid and it should not be used. So I think that's essential. In certain contexts, there are allegations that due to security reasons, there should be someone in the room and you cannot be in private. And the Istanbul Protocol says that it's the psychologist or the doctor who must decide. And you have to make a balance between security and the right to privacy. In my personal experience, I've done assessment of cases in many, many places, and I have never had the feeling that I was in danger. I think that the survivor knows very clearly who are you and that you are there to help. And the idea that you are in danger is probably more something that the guards introduce for you to be afraid, that not that there is a real threat. But you are right, that's an essential element. And
yeah, I could add that, because that's very often a challenge when you are participating in an MPM visiting team, because guards will often say, oh no, you may not speak of people in private. And I have been myself member of the SBT, the subcommittee in the UN, and have been speaking with criminals in private in the strangest places. So yes, it is. I think they understand that you're there to help. That's not to be naive, but one can have one's own guards, but not one has to speak in private. But it's important also that the Istanbul Protocol says very clearly that you cannot report unless you are a forensic doctor who are being given that as a job to do an evaluation of damages or injuries, unless that is your role, and you have to be crystal clear about what your role is. The Istanbul Protocol says that you should not report on torture cases if the person is not willing for you to do that, because you know that if you come into a prison and you see that someone has been injured and you do an examination and you do report on that, the person can be just beat up again the next day or the following day if you don't have any measures to protect. So in such cases where the person will not want you to report, you have to try to find ways to do it in a more anonymous way, so that you can still complain about the things going on in that system for it to be stopped and investigated, rather than using one person who might easily become a scapegoat or a new victim in the situation. But this is probably one of the most difficult discussions we had during the updating. I can tell you we were tens of people discussing this for weeks. How can we formulate this so we can deal with all our, all the medical ethics and all things that are described other places? Thank you.
Yeah, which brings us to the question about somebody asked about how do you agree that psychological association have the responsibility to support psychologists who report, for example, situation of violation or torture, etc.? Do you agree with this? That there is a responsibility to support psychologists who report this kind of situations?
Well, I think, first of all, the legal system in the country should support the person, because also under the, as Pau already mentioned, Article 13 in the Convention Against Torture says that every state has the obligation to do prompt and independent investigations into any allegation of torture. So, but if they fail to do so, definitely we need civil society organizations such as our own organizations, which I think should be an important support. But we may have, for instance, OMCT, Amnesty, others to support us in such a report, because we may risk, we know today that people who report, people who denounce human rights violations are themselves in risk of being violated. So it is an issue.
Yeah.
We have to
I
know
will,
about
I
that.
will add that, well, of course, the Istanbul Protocol, but also common sense says that the doctors, psychologists must denounce torture when they know a case. But in Chapter 7 of the Istanbul Protocol, it also says for the first time that the supervisor, the responsible of the clinician, is also responsible and must protect and must support the professional who is making the claim or who is informing about the case. So there is a legal obligation of the psychological profession to protect those members who are making public cases of torture.
Okay. Okay, I think it's time to close the discussion, unfortunately, because it's so interesting and so important. And this is a subject that, in terms of human rights and of humanity, is so important to address. Thank you very much for both of you. Thank you, really. And Marlena, you want to conclude?
Yes. Yes, I would love to conclude. Thank you very much, Amy, for moderating the discussion. And of course, to Nora and Pau, I saw some questions and comments, and I would like to say something about education, because somebody said that they would love to start the discussion about teaching human rights in the UK. I know for sure there was Derek Indo here, one of the participants who is from the BPS, from the British Psychological Society, who is involved very much in human rights and psychology. So I'm sure there will be some discussions. And I'm happy that we have Nora here, who was the initiator of the first ever section of human rights in a psychological association, in the Norwegian Psychological Association some 20 or 30 years ago. And you're also the first country that had the course in human rights for psychology students, but still it hasn't widespread as we would like it to be. So this is a good point to think about that. I invite all of you who took part in this webinar, if you know of any examples how human rights are taught in psychology studies anywhere in the world, please add that in your evaluation forms, because we will give you automatically, we will send you evaluation forms for this topic for today's webinar. So please feel free to share information, and then we will try, because one of our goals in the global network of psychologists for human rights is to collect materials, learning and teaching materials in human rights for psychologists. So that's going to be useful for us. Nora, you were about to say something. Please unmute.
Yeah. I just wanted to remind all of you on the Global Network website, because there you also have the document that I put on the, I tried to find the link, but I didn't in the hurry. It says it's a document for inspiration. And this is the document that you find on the first page of the Global webpage. And you can read it because it says something about what kind of activities are going on. And really, there's a lot of studies you can do, finding things on the internet, especially through the Global Network, and also to the MMHR that I will write here in the you can, and this also you will find a lot of information about human rights and health. So this is quick, but you'll find information on that also on the webpage to the Global Network. So thank you for giving me the additional word.
Exactly. Thank you. Also, somebody mentioned Sam McFarland, our colleague from the United States, who published several books on the topic. And there is a link in the chat, so you can find some information about teaching as well. So thank you, Nora, for sharing this link about mental health and human rights. Which brings me to the announcement of our next topic. So our next webinar is going to is taking place on the last day of October, so October 31st. And the topic will be related to the International Mental Health Day, which is 10th of October. So the title of the topic is Human Rights and Mental Health. Our speakers will be Stephen Marks, Helen Verdelli, and Sandra Willis. So we would like to welcome you then as well as we did today. Let me just remind you briefly that you will receive the evaluation form. So please, this gives us feedback for our future work. And the next thing is the certificates. Some of you asked about the certificates. We send them automatically to everyone who attended the webinar for at least 40 minutes. We send the certificates directly to the addresses where you registered from. In case that you watch this webinar from a different address, please let us know on the email that you will find on our website of the Global Network, which is, you can see it here. Thank you very much for your attention, for your questions, for the discussion, and thank you very much to our speakers who brought so many participants. Actually, we had more than 100 people who attended the topic. Thank you very much, and thank you, Ame, and thank you, Mary, for being the great host. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.